Hello. All right, we're continuing our notes for the ecology unit. Yesterday we talked about mutualism and some other things. Today we're talking about parasitism and commensalism. So these are all forms of symbiotic relationships where there's an interaction between two organisms, and it can sometimes be good for both. It can sometimes be good for one and not good for the other. And so we're going to continue on with those kinds of symbiotic relationships. So today we're going to talk about commensalism. Commensalism is a term that scientists use to describe a relationship between two species where one species benefits from being near the other and the other organism is seemingly unaffected. The commensal, which is the species that benefits, so we call that the commensal, could receive nutrients, protection, or transport services from the host. So you see here a shark, and these are the remoras, which are these types of fish that hook onto sharks. You've probably seen them if you've watched any of those Shark Week videos or Shark Week shows on Discovery Channel. And the remoras attached to a shark. And so we're going to see that in just a second. But the host itself is the unaffected species. Now, scientists have actually figured out that if you go and research this a little more, there actually is a mutualistic relationship in some way. It somehow does benefit the shark. But upon first understanding, it seems commensal, where the remora is obviously being benefited, that's why it's doing it, and the shark is seemingly unaffected. So remoras are the fish that travel close to sharks and sometimes even attach themselves to the shark. They do not harm the shark, and they eat the scraps left over after the shark's meal. So they'll hang on for the ride, and then when the shark is destroying whatever it's eating, there are chunks that kind of float around, and the remoras will eat that. So that is an example of a commensal relationship. So that's commensalism. There are many bacterial and fungal species that live on the human skin that have a commensal relationship with us. They benefit basically, so they have a commensal relationship with humans. They benefit by consuming our dead skin cells and other substances that contact our skin, but they do not harm us. Our innate immune system keep them from becoming parasitic species. So they don't harm us because our immune system kind of keeps them at bay. However, in patients that are immunocompromised, like patients that are undergoing chemotherapy or taking immunosuppressant drugs, if they're immunocompromised, some of these same commensal species can actually become parasites. So then they would be parasitic and harmful. And they can grow out of control and cause disease. So that's why when you are immunocompromised, it's important that you are really careful about hygiene and just managing your health overall, because lots of these things that are normally fine can actually kind of go out of control and our immune system can't manage it. So that's commensalism, where we have, I always do the smiley faces. So commensalism is where one individual is happy and the other one doesn't care. Okay? Now we have an amensal relationship. Amensal, that A means not. We've learned that before. So amensalism is the term that scientists use to describe a relationship between two species where one organism harms another organism but does not receive any benefits itself. Now that seems like, why would it even do that, right? Like that doesn't seem like it makes even any sense. A lot of times these situations happen by accident. So plants are often the victims of commensalism when they are trampled or broken by a passing animal, while the animal receives no real benefit in return. So that's an commensal relationship. So if we're drawing our smiley faces, that would be a frowny face and a neither happy nor frowny face. So one is harmed and one is not affected. Okay, so that's commensalism and amensalism. Go to the next page. Here we're going to talk about parasitism. We're very familiar with the idea of parasitism, but let's look at it a little bit closer. So let's talk about some characteristics of parasites. So first of all, parasites are organisms that feed or depend on another organism, but do not kill the other organism. And that other organism that they, the organism that is they're feeding off of is called the host. So it's not killed, but it's hosting the parasite. They often live in or on their hosts. Parasites often reduce host fitness. Fitness is its ability to be healthy or thrive. So when it says parasites often reduce host fitness, that means like the health of that host, its ability to continue to grow and develop and do all the things that a living thing needs to do. They have adapted and gained abilities to steal energy and resources from the host in order to grow and reproduce. Some parasites even prevent their hosts from being able to reproduce. Some parasitic plants are called hemiparasites. They do a little photosynthesis at some point in their life cycle, but they also steal water and nutrients from the host plant. Mistletoe is a great example of a hemiparasitic plant. Mistletoe grows up in the trees, and it's able to do photosynthesis, but it also steals nutrients and water from that tree in order to continue to grow. I think some of us noticed some, I know during third period, there is some mistletoe patches and some trees out in the field, on the practice fields. Victoria had pointed out one at some point, but that's a hemiparasitic. It just means that it can do some photosynthesis, but it steals a lot of its resources from the host. Parasites sometimes are carried from host to host by a third-party intermediate carrier organism called a vector. Parasites cannot reproduce inside the intermediate host. They often must be transmitted to a host before they can complete their life cycle. For example, the mosquito which doesn't have an E, is a vector for the Plasmodium parasite that causes malaria, which we talked about in the past, that malaria, the mosquito is considered the deadliest animal on the planet because it carries this Plasmodium parasite and kills so many humans per year because there's not access to health care in some of the places where it's the worst. So humans, we are the Plasmodium's host, but the mosquito is the vector. So it's the intermediate. The Plasmodium is the parasite, the mosquito is the vector, and the human is the host. So you can see over here that this is the example. So here we have the human blood cells from the host. The Plasmodium get inside those after the mosquito injects it. But it doesn't harm the mosquito when it's in the mosquito. It's just a carrier. So then sometimes parasites can even modify the host or vector behavior. The Toxoplasma parasite host is the cat. So if a rat, which is the vector, so in this case it's the host is the cat, the rat is the vector, and the Toxoplasma is the parasite. If a rat gets infected, the parasite infects its brain and changes the behavior of the rat. Rats without Toxoplasma avoid cat odors, but rats infected with Toxoplasma are attracted to cat odors, increasing the chances that they will be consumed by a cat and the parasite can continue its life cycle. So we read about that when we did that Toxoplasma reading assignment at home. So this is parasitism. Again, when we talk about parasitism, we have one that's sad and one that's happy. Because one organism is benefiting and the other one's being harmed. Okay, last page. Now we need to talk about competition, because when we talk about ecology and we're talking about organisms and environment and how they interact, so we know that they can work together in symbiotic relationships and they can both be happy, or one can be harmed and one can be benefiting, and all those different symbiotic relationships that we just addressed. Now we're going to talk about the fact that we also have competition that comes into play between relationships of organisms in an environment. So competition as a community relationship is a relationship between two species that have niches that overlap to some extent. Competing animal species may compete for nesting sites, for their food, and maybe even for access to water. Plants also compete with each other. Maybe you've noticed that. How would a plant compete with one another? Think about an area where there's an overgrowth of plants. How do they compete? Think about what they're competing for. They're competing for sunlight. They're competing for water and nutrients. And so, but they do compete. So they're differently than animals, of course, but they do compete with each other. So plants compete for nitrogen and other minerals in the soil. With plants that are near them. So their root systems expand below ground and they compete. Look at this picture here. Down at the bottom, you can see root systems that are competing with each other for these nutrients. You can imagine all these little dots are the nutrients in the soil, and the roots are going to spread out to try to gain access to those nutrients. And if there's multiple plants, then they have to compete with each other to get them. Their roots expand in the soil beneath them to try to maximize their surface area. Of the root network. Plants also compete for water. They have adapted to be very good at absorbing water from the soil around them. And some have adapted to keep their leaves from losing too much water when water is scarce. Remember, we talked about C4 and C3 plants back in the fall when talking about photosynthesis, and how some plants close their stomata even during or close their stomata during the daytime because it's much too hot and they would lose a lot of water. So they shut their stomata, which are those openings on the underside of the leaf, and by doing that, it allows the plant to not lose water. And then they open them at night, and they've saved up what they've collected during the day. They've saved that up to then run the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration during the nighttime. So we talked about that back in the fall. Plants also compete with each other for sunlight. Have you ever seen a tree that grows kind of crooked with the, it's almost like the trunk of the tree kind of comes out, goes long, and then comes up like this? That is because that tree is trying to gain access to this the upper canopy where it can reach the sun. So that is how they would compete for sunlight. They are often competing with nearby plants to grow taller in order to get the most sun. Some plants who have been unable to outcompete with height have adapted a characteristic called shade tolerance. They grow more slowly, but they are able to survive with less sunlight exposure. So some of these plants that have shade tolerance are able to still grow, but it's very slow, and then they just manage with the amount of light they can get. So imagine being in the kind of the depths of a forest. You're not getting a lot of light, but there are still plants that grow. They've just adapted with some shade tolerance. So when we're talking about plants in competition, we can see that plants compete with each other too, not just animals. Animals do compete, obviously, and we're very aware of that when they compete for resources, but plants do the same thing. Okay, so this is your notes for Thursday, and make sure you do the homework page linked in Google Classroom as well. See you tomorrow.